You're good to go.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. How are we doing today? Glad you guys could make it out on this absolutely bitter evening, but I'm glad that you did. I'm here to share with you a presentation that I call Key to Liberty, the underwater archaeology of the American Revolution on Lake Champlain. And it's, it's going to be just like it says on the tin here. We're going to talk about what we found on the bottom that represents the naval actions that took place on Lake Champlain during 1776 predominantly. And I'm going to present this as a historical overview first. There's three main components of the Battle of Lake Champlain that took place in 1776. We're going to just go through those in order historically, and then we'll go back and look at them in the same sequence as the evidence for each of those segments of the conflict is revealed through the archaeology. I guess I should do a brief introduction. My name is Chris Sabick. I'm the Director of Research and Archaeology at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, where I've worked for 2 decades. And I arrived in Vermont as an intern in the late 90s and just basically never left. And eventually they promoted me. So here I am today. But have had the opportunity to work on many of the projects that we're going to discuss today and the current research that we're actively have going on right now. So let's do a quick little geography to start with, right? Lake Champlain runs north-south. It's about 122 miles long, 14 miles wide at its widest point, which is basically from Burlington over towards Plattsburgh and Port Kent. The really important geography here is that length of the lake and that it runs north-south. The lake empties out the northern end through the Richelieu River into the St. Lawrence. And it's at its southern end, at what's now Whitehall, New York, it almost reaches the headwaters of the Hudson River. So it was this, technical difficulties. It was this water highway through what was in the 18th century a wilderness that really made control of Lake Champlain so vital for the military efforts that were happening during the Revolutionary War. Your ability to travel or to move large amounts of men or material through the wilderness was dramatically easier on the waterways than it would have been marching through the mountains and through the woods along either side of the lake. So control of this corridor was absolutely vital. And that had been the case in the French and Indian War prior to the Revolution and in the other colonial wars that happened in the area in the earlier 18th century. Now, activity on Lake Champlain really started in 1775. All of Lake Champlain was held by the British at the time. 1775 in May, Benedict Arnold and a group of Green Mountain Boys led by Ethan Allen raided Fort Ticonderoga and captured it, and then took all the cannon, or a bunch of the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, and sent them down to Boston so they could participate in the Battle of Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. That success, that early success, they actually arrived at Fort Ticonderoga before the British garrison even knew that there was conflict happening. So they kind of took them unawares, and they continued that success up the length of Lake Champlain, captured Fort St. John at the very northern end of the lake, which only shows up in my next image here. And Fort St. John is right at the rapids in the Richelieu, which make the navigation from Lake Champlain to St. Lawrence impossible. So they were now controlled both ends of the lake and the fort at Ticonderoga in the middle. Lake Champlain was then a launching pad for the invasion of Canada that happened in the fall and winter of 1775, led by our good friend Benedict Arnold here. At least one of the avenues of attack to Quebec was led by Benedict Arnold. That effort to capture Quebec, they did capture Montreal, but they failed to capture Quebec and were repelled during a New Year's Eve assault on Quebec City. Many of the enlistments for many of the troops that were involved in the American Army at the time were going to expire at the end of the year. So they decided to force one more assault on the fortifications at Quebec City to see if they could capture it before the enlistment ran out, and they failed. And then 10,000 British regulars showed up as reinforcements from Europe, and the Americans beat a hasty retreat back, I guess that would be up the St. Lawrence and then up Lake Champlain, falling all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga and to the very southern end of the lake to Skeensboro, which is what we know now today as Whitehall, New York. And in Skeensboro, they found an ironworks and a number of sawmills, and they took over those possessions from a loyalist gentleman in the area named Skeen, which is why Philip Skeen, which is why that was known as Skeensboro. And this proved to be the perfect place for them to start to build a fleet to at least delay, if not repel, the expected invasion of Lake Champlain that was coming in the summer of 1776. So they added to their existing fleet, the Americans, their existing fleet of small vessels, a couple of which they had captured from the British the previous year when they captured Fort St. John, like the Rogal or the schooner Royal Sabick, which is in the middle here. These were small lake sailing vessels. You know, they carried a couple of guns, but not powerful or purpose-built warships necessarily. So the Americans started building two different vessel types. First was the gunboats, which we have here on the left. These are very simple vessels. It's kind of like an expanded bateau. It's flat-bottomed, 54 feet long, 15 feet wide, carries 3 guns. Very conveniently, all 3 of those guns point in different directions. So this makes it a very impractical fighting vessel. You have to literally turn the vessel to bring the individual guns to bear. It's only rigged with square sails, so while it sails downwind okay, any other wind, forget about it. You're rowing. With no keel and no depth of hold there, that the boat would just slip sideways with any kind of wind that wasn't directly astern. Arnold, realizing the limitation of this design, after they had built 8 of them, decided to start building some row galleys as well. It's a much larger vessel. This is 75 feet long, about 20 feet wide, carrying at least 10 guns, could carry up to 12. Not all of them were fully equipped. Rigged with lateen sails, which is a very interesting choice and one I still don't quite fully understand. But were much better sailors than the gunboats, and still had the option of rowing if need be. And so they were, by the end of the summer, able to assemble a fleet of 15 vessels. As summer wore on and this fleet became prepared, it set out with Arnold to explore the lake and actually position themselves at the northern end of the lake to try to repel the expected British assault. Because they were well aware that the British were doing the same thing at the northern end of the lake. They were building a fleet as well. And their fleet included a number of sailing vessels that they actually dismantled from the St. Lawrence and brought up the rapids and then reassembled in St. John. They built a whole bunch of gunboats as well. They didn't bother with 3 guns on their boats. They made them a little bit smaller and they just put 1 gun in the bow, which frankly makes the most sense. And they even built the Inflexible, which was the largest sailing ship to operate on the lake at the time. This is about 140 feet long, carried, I think, 22 guns. You know, a significant fighting vessel. This fleet was built well into the fall, and it wasn't until October 11th that these 2 fleets finally met in combat. Arnold had maneuvered his fleet around the lake in the meantime, exploring different coves and positions that he might take up, doing a lot of soundings around and trying to find just the right place to establish his fleet. He knew that the British fleet was going to have much larger vessels and was going to be much better manned, right? They took actual Royal Navy sailors from the St. Lawrence fleet and the East Coast and brought them up to Lake Champlain, where Arnold, who did have some sailing experience himself, as did some of his vessel captains. The crew members were almost exclusively soldiers that were recruited into the Navy, so to speak. So he knew that they weren't going to be the most effective fighting force, but he was trying to find the most advantageous position for them to take. So he chose to hide his fleet behind Valcour Island, which is a large island in the middle of Lake Champlain, just a little bit south of Plattsburgh. Arnold set his fleet up in a crescent between the island and the New York shoreline. and he waited for the British to come to him. Now, the British coming down from the north, they had to wait until a wind was blowing out of the north to come out of St. John. They came down the lake, and it wasn't until they had passed Valcourt Island that they could actually see the American fleet hidden here. This meant that they had to sail up into the wind to try to come to grips with the American fleet. Some of their better sailing vessels, they had a couple of schooners in their fleet as well. Those were able to beat up into the wind and come to grips. The little gunboats could row up and participate in the battle. But there are larger vessels, including the Inflexible, that big frigate we were looking at, and this really interesting vessel called a radeau, which was basically just a floating gun barge. They couldn't sail up into the wind. So they actually got stranded down here and played a very minimal part in the battle. I don't know if the Thunderer even fired a shot in anger that day. So already Arnold's position is looking pretty clever. He's eliminated the largest vessels from the British fleet. But there was still a hard-fought day on October 11th. The fighting started around 11 in the morning and lasted until the sunset. This is October, so that's 5:30ish, probably 6 o'clock. And the majority of the fighting on the British side was done by their gunboat fleet and the schooner Carleton, which was able to get into range. The Americans took the heaviest damage in this exchange, with about 60 men killed and at least as many more wounded. And they also found themselves running low on ammunition and gunpowder. So also, as night started to fall, the gunboat Philadelphia, which had been struck in the bow by a 24-pound cannonball, sank. Luckily, the crew members were able to escape from the Philadelphia onto the row galley, Washington. You may notice this is Washington in the background here, but it only has one of those big triangular sails that we looked at with the row galleys, the lateen rig. Its foremast had been completely shot away during the battle, so it was reduced to one mast and one sail at this point, and that's gonna play a significant role in our story as we continue as well. Philadelphia sank, and the British decided to pull their forces back to the line indicated by the blue arrows there, and they set up what they thought was a pretty tight cordon between the island and the shoreline to try to prevent the Americans escaping, and figured that they would close in for the kill on the 12th. Now, the British did have, I believe it was 18 vessels in their fleet, but that distance between the southern end of Valcourt Island and the New York shore down there is well over a mile. So these boats were still pretty spaced out. And it appears that the British were pretty cautious about being close to the New York shore at all, fearing the shoal water there. So that left a gap in their cordon, and the American fleet, I think very audaciously got themselves into single file line in the middle of the night. They shielded a lantern on three sides and put it in the stern of each vessel, so it could only be seen from directly astern. They got into single file line, and they snaked their way along the New York shore and past the British. And that's the line indicated by the red arrows there. Now, they may have been aided to some extent by the burning of the Royal Savage. At the beginning of the battle, the Royal Savage, this schooner that they had captured from St. John's in 1775, had actually had ducked around Valcourt Island to see if the British were coming. It started to go around the southern tip of the island, and the fleet was right there. So they immediately came back around due to some poor sail handling and maybe a couple of cannonball strikes from the British fleet. The Royal Savage was run up on the rocks at the southern end of the island and had to be abandoned. Though it was a little messier than that, but that's the simple story. It was fought back and forth over the remains of the Royal Savage during the day. But at night, to deny the Americans from coming back and reoccupying the Royal Savage, the British burned that schooner. And undoubtedly, this was a fantastic distraction for the Americans sneaking away in the dark. I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that you have to imagine that most of these sailors were probably functionally deaf at this point. After listening to cannons firing hundreds of shots all day long, I'm sure that they didn't hear these boats rowing by and were a little bit distracted by this great burning and exploding ship of the Royal Savage. So the Americans fled over the night of the 11th into the 12th south, so that's up the lake. And they took a brief pause in the middle of the night at Schuyler Island, which is about 4 miles south of Valcour Bay where the battle took place. And here they had to abandon 2 of their gunboats, which had been badly damaged. That was the gunboat New Jersey and the gunboat Spitfire. Spitfire sank into deep water. The New Jersey, they lit on fire and figured it would burn to the waterline and then sank, but the British actually got there before it burned up and were able to put out the fire and bring that vessel into their fleet. As dawn broke on the 12th, the American fleet continued up the lake, and the British, of course, once the sun came up, realized that the Americans had escaped and set off south after them. Both fleets were facing contrary winds. The winds were out of the south, so there was a lot of rowing going on and probably a lot of swearing and cursing as they fought for every mile up the lake that they could. No real contact happening on the 12th, but by the morning of the 13th, the British were catching up to the American fleet. The wind had shifted to the north, and of course, that north wind got to the British fleet first. So they were able to close up on the American fleet before the wind got to them. And they caught up with the American fleet near Split Rock Mountain, which is actually not far from where the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum is located. And this led to a running gun battle. Now the American fleet is stretched out. They're all badly damaged from the fighting on the 11th. The Washington, that row galley that had one of its masts shot away, is really lagging behind and is eventually captured by the British fleet. The crew of the Philadelphia, realizing that the captain of the Washington was going to strike her colors and surrender, they all jumped into a bateau and rowed to shore because they didn't want to be captured. And then they made their way overland down to Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga, which is probably an exciting story in and of itself. But now the British surrounded the American fleet and were really pummeling them. Where the gunboats had done most of the fighting for the British on the 11th, now the larger ships were able to come and bring their full broadsides to bear on the struggling American fleet as it continued to try to get to the south. And what ensued was a 2.5-hour running gun battle from Split Rock Mountain to a location on the Vermont shore that was at the time called Ferris's Bay. And the description of this running gun battle is pretty intense. The British ships were taking turns sailing across the sterns of the American ships and blasting a whole broadside into them and really causing tremendous damage throughout. Arnold, realizing that he was going to lose the fleet if he didn't do something drastic, chose to drive it, the 5 remaining vessels that he had, which was the row galley Congress, the Washington was already captured, and the other row galley, the Trumbull, had actually sailed far enough ahead that it wasn't going to be part of this conflict. So he had the Congress and he had 4 of the gunboats remaining in the fleet. He decided to drive them into Ferris's Bay and burn them so that they wouldn't be captured by the British and taken into their service. So Arnold pulled into Ferris's Bay, which is a place that he was familiar with. And it was called Ferris's Bay because the Ferris family were homesteaders that lived on the shoreline there. And they were well known in the area and frequent place for travelers to stop when they were in the area. Arnold and the fleet had actually stopped just north of Ferris Bay on their journey north earlier in the summer of 1776. So they were well familiar with the Ferrises and the bay. This is another really clever choice of Arnold's. Ferris's Bay it's a relatively small bay. It's only about 300 yards deep and wide, and it's shallow. It's 15 feet at the mouth of the bay, and it just gets shallower as you come in. He knew that his flat-bottom gunboats and his rogue galley could get into that shoal water pretty easily, but the larger British vessels would be afraid of running aground if they came in after them. So he ran the 5 ships ashore. They set them on alight with their flags still flying. The crew jumped overboard, carried what they could up a very steep slope from the shoreline up into the Ferris's farm fields. Here they set up a defensive position. They made a line of battle here just to try to repel any attempts by the British who might send landing force in bateau or smaller vessels to try to capture the vessels, the American fleet. So they stayed there until they were confident that the vessels were fully engaged and were unsalvageable. Meanwhile, the British, this is kind of from the British point of view here, the British are attacking back and forth across the mouth of the harbor and just shooting at the American forces on bluff. Once they're confident that the fleet is destroyed, the Americans take the Ferrises with them and they march overland down to Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga. Ferrises were definitely patriots. They were not loyalists, and they were happy to travel with the army as it went south. Okay, so those are the 3 phases of the Battle of Lake Champlain that we're going to talk about archaeologically. Right? We have the battle at Valcour, we have the escape, and then we have the burning of the fleet here in Ferris's Bay, which I will mistakenly call Arnold's Bay over and over again because that's what it's known as now. So just Ferris Bay and Arnold's Bay are the same thing. So let's look at one of the first things to be recovered from the Valcour Bay battle site was actually the remains of the Royal Sabick that we talked about previously, that had been run up on the southern end of the island and set alight and burned. This vessel was discovered in 1934 by this gentleman here, Lorenzo Hagland. Not that it had ever really been lost. This was a site throughout the 19th century and early 20th century that lots of people came and pulled timbers off of or collected artifacts from, because it was in shallow water. It's probably still visible from the surface most days. But Hagland and his crew, Hagland was a retired U.S. Navy diver and ran a marine salvage operation. And he vacationed on Lake Champlain, became enamored with the history, the naval history on the lake, set about finding shipwrecks, and it's something he did for the next 30 years. First one that kind of lit the fire for Hagland was the Royal Sabick. So he found it, he floated it with some oil barrels that he used as pontoons, basically. He lifted it up off the bottom and then they winched it ashore. This is actually a picture, it's hard to see, but that's him sitting on the remains as it was dragged ashore, and he's making a nice drawing of what he sees, which is great because in that drawing he actually labeled, he put numbers on all the timbers, and then he took the boat apart. He took all the pieces apart, he put them in a storage container, and they took them back over to the mainland, and he, stuffed them under his porch is the one story I've heard, after they couldn't find a museum to take them. So, and then he became distracted. I should mention that about 1,500 artifacts were also recovered with the Royal Sabick. This includes lots of buttons, utensil handles, these fantastic boarding axes. It's a great little canteen, and all kinds of iron implements and weapons. All of this stuff luckily stayed together with the disarticulated vessel remains. It's a long, convoluted story, but the Royal Sabick timbers and artifact collection have finally, as of 2015, been claimed by the U.S. Navy, and they are now at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., where they're doing a digital reconstruction. They've 3D modeled all the timbers, and they're reassembling them in a computer and making models. It's fantastic work, and they're conserving all of these artifacts as well. So that's ongoing work and something I'm excited to see progress. Really cool stuff they're working on. But Haglund became distracted by the Philadelphia. He found the Philadelphia in 1935, sunk in about 55 feet of water, and decided to raise that too. What the heck? So this is a picture of it breaking water in 1935. You can see the vessel is intact, right? The mast is still there. The guns are still in place. The bow gun is still in place. The two waist guns have tipped over. Still full of artifacts. There's these amazing photos of them actually pumping it dry enough to float out, and then they're just using fire hoses to wash all the stuff out of the inside of the boat, which I'm sure they probably lost a few artifacts doing that, but really remarkably well preserved. Haglund put this vessel on a barge, and it traveled around the Champlain Valley as a tourist attraction for a number of years. He worked tirelessly to try to find a museum that would take this vessel and put it on display. And that actually didn't happen until he died in the early 1960s, when the Smithsonian stepped in and said, we'll take it. And it's still on display at the National Museum of American History in DC to this day. I just watched a fantastic presentation yesterday about the future conservation work that they're going to do on this hull, even though it's been out of the water for almost 100 years now. But it's really desiccated and shrunken, and they need to do some stabilizing on it. But remarkably well preserved at the time of its raising. When it was brought into the Smithsonian, they did an incredibly detailed documentation of the hull remains and made this really detailed set of plans for the vessel, which the Maritime Museum, the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, used to build a replica, a faithful replica of this boat that was launched in 1991. And that is still at the Maritime Museum, though unfortunately no longer on the water. It's now quite old as well, and sank a couple of years ago. We used to have it on the water. It sank a couple of years ago, and once we raised it, we determined that's probably best for it to stay on shore for now. Still a very excellent interpretive tool to have on campus. The site of the Battle of Valcour Bay itself had become a very popular place for scuba divers to go in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Some of these folks would take a scuba course, and their final checkout dive would be, let's go to Valcour Bay and find some cannonballs. So, everyone and their uncle has a couple of cannonballs or something they found in Valcour Bay. We had been laboring under the assumption that the site had probably been pretty picked clean. Until this gentleman on the far left over here, Ed Skolin, who is now he's a retired New York State Police diver. He was active at the time. He was in Valcour Bay doing some work with a new metal detector that the state police had acquired, and he found buried under 2 feet of mud this cannon muzzle, right, where the back of the cannon was broken off of it. And thankfully, he was conscious enough to call the New York State Museum and call the New York State Historic Preservation Officer and to call the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. He left the artifact in place, but let us know where it was. And that became the launching point for the Valcour Bay Research Project, which extended from 1999 to 2004, involved archaeological divers from Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, but also incorporated a lot of folks from the local dive community who had previously been collectors of artifacts. We wanted to bring them into the process of documenting this battlefield so that we could expose to them, how to do things archaeologically correctly and the importance of context, right? Finding a cannonball is great, but finding 10 cannonballs and how they're arranged and next to that sunken boat, that's where the story lies. So context is everything. In order to document that context, we gridded off the bottom of the lake into 50-foot squares, with our center point right here being where that cannon muzzle was located. Each of these squares was intensely metal detected, and You can see here we covered nearly 200,000 square feet of the lake bottom. And this would be just of the American line of battle. And this is probably maybe 20% of the American line of battle. So there's still lots of interesting work to do out there. But it revealed several hundred artifacts that we had no idea were there. As you would imagine from a naval site, there's lots of shot. We have lots of different sizes of round shot, from small canister and grape shot up to 24-pound cannonballs. We have a number of interesting pieces of shot, like this is bar shot. This would have been fired out of a normal cannon barrel, but as it came out of the cannon muzzle, it would start to spin and tumble, and it was really good at cutting the sails and rigging out of enemy ships. It also must have just made a horrendous noise as it flew through the air towards you. I can't even imagine. And somewhat surprisingly, we found a number of unexploded shells. Right? Cannons, at this point in history, they fired solid shot. When that was in the form of a cannonball, a canister of small little cannonballs, grape shot of medium-sized cannonballs, but it was all solid shot. Shells were only fired by mortars or howitzers. These are pieces of ordnance that would lob their shell, right? As opposed to a cannon that's more like a rifle. It's a direct fire. These are the bombs bursting in air you hear about in the national anthem. And they're very unusual to find at a naval site. This is it's a hollow cast iron sphere that had a powder charge inside and a wooden plug fuse that you had to cut to length. And how much you cut that fuse determined how far the ball would fly before it exploded. The ideal situation being it would explode right overhead of your enemy, and all those lovely pieces of hot iron would come down on them. Now, you can imagine why this is unusual in a naval battle. If you're on a boat that's moving and rocking and you're trying to hit another boat, 700 yards away that's also moving and bobbing, timing that fuse to explode is probably pretty difficult. As we started to research why we were fighting these shells here, we did find out that some of the British gunboat fleet was manned by Hessian mercenaries who were howitzer men. So, like their American counterparts, they had been recruited into the Navy, and they brought their howitzers with them, and they set them up on these gunboats, and they were lobbing shells at the American fleet. We found several solid, complete ones, which either the fuse didn't light as it was fired from the howitzer, or it hit the water before the fuse went off. Whatever the case may be, they didn't explode. We did find quite a few fragments as well, of ones that did go off. We found quite a few personal armaments, excellent belt axe, a partial bayonet. On the lower left is a fragment of a short sword. And most interesting was this cartridge box, which consisted of a wooden block with, I think it's 17 holes that were drilled in it. And each of those holes would have held a pre-measured paper cartridge for a musket, right? That included a pre-measured amount of gunpowder and the lead ball in a paper tube that you would use to load your musket. Now, it was wrapped in a leather pouch and had a thick leather flap that would hang over it when it wasn't in use, because you didn't want sparks from your musket firing to fall into your pouch and go kablooey. That would ruin your day. It had a shoulder strap with a brass buckle, which we found, and thank God it had that brass buckle and the lead musket balls inside, or the metal detector would have not picked up this item. So this was one of the few pieces of organic material that we found because this was a metal detecting survey. But there was a musket ball in each of those holes. Inside the pouch, there was also a number of broken flints. There was actually a couple of new flints and a couple of worn out flints from a musket. So whoever's pouch this was, he was holding on to his old worn out flints so he could reshape them later and use them again. Unfortunately, lost his pouch during the battle. Remarkably, in addition to the muzzle of the gun, as the survey of the lake bottom continued, we found 5 more pieces of the same cannon, scattered over about 400 square feet. And it really became apparent that this cannon exploded during the course of the battle, scattering particularly these pieces of the top of the back of the gun really far away, which makes sense, I suppose. The bottom of the gun was probably blown down into the boat. The upper parts were flung out of the boat. The muzzle just tipped and fell into the lake.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
The howitzers,
Yes.
how are they projected? Are they out of a cannon? What?
Yeah, it looks like a very short cannon.
Okay, so if they exploded in the air, what projected them?
Well, so they were fired out of the cannon with a gunpowder, where they're fired out of the howitzer with a gunpowder charge.
Yeah.
And it was that charge being ignited that was supposed to light the fuse on the way out, this short stubby barrel that was, elevated compared to a long gun. And then it would lob and
Yes. Any of the markings or ciphers existing on it?
on the cannon.
No.
Well, what we did find was we only have one of the trunnions, right? That's this little nub that sticks out the side. And there is a mark on the end. It's difficult to interpret what it is. It looks like half a clover leaf.
The Ordnance Society in England.
We have reached out to a number of different organizations. There is also a Roman numeral stamped into the muzzle of the gun. Our best inclination is that this is actually a Swedish cannon. It is a Finn maker from Sweden, which in and of itself is a super interesting story, because how the hell did that get to North America? In all likelihood, this was a cannon that was cast by the Swedish. It was captured by the French on the continent at some point. It was brought over and put into Fort St. Frederick, which was right next to Crown Point, which is a big British base that came after the French and Indian War. That fort was eventually abandoned. And then in 1776, when the Americans were desperate for guns, they were going around everywhere, digging up old guns. And they probably dug this up from the remains of Crown Point and cleaned it up and put it into action. There is one of the guns on the Philadelphia also turned out to be Swedish. So not impossible, but there's an interesting story here for sure that we haven't been able to completely track down. But in a more immediate sense, we did find out some more information about this gun exploding. In addition to the gun itself, we found a fragment of the carriage it was sitting on. This is the cheek, one of the sides of a gun carriage. It's hard to discern here, but it's made up of several big slabs of wood that have bolts driven straight down through them. And on the fragment that we have, it's blown apart. You can tell that these iron rods sticking out the bottom have been bent over like this. So as the gun in between these two sides of the carriage exploded, those two pieces peeled out. One of them broke off and it was dumped overboard. And that's what that carriage piece is there. The other interesting thing about this carriage piece is that the cap square, that's that curved piece at the top that would fit around the trunnion of the gun to form the hinge. It's for the wrong size gun. So it had some lead shims crammed in there to try to make it fit. This is something we're going to come back to, this kind of ad hoc nature of the American armaments. Because I should have mentioned when we were looking at this stuff, this belt axe is really 1760s pattern belt axe. That bayonet is from the 1740s. The sword is contemporaneous and is the pouch, but these two pieces are almost certainly somebody who was a veteran of the French and Indian War, or whose father was a veteran of the French and Indian War, and they went and got their old equipment and took it off the battle. So interesting stuff there. So what we were able to determine was that that's a 6-pound cannon. That means it fires a 6-pound cannonball. There was only one vessel in the American fleet that had 6-pound cannon that we know the fate of, and that was the gunboat New York. So we started to research the gunboat New York and its crew, and in the process, we found a pension request from a gentleman named Jehaziel Sherman, who reported being an active member of the crew of the New York when a cannon exploded on the vessel, wounding him and killing the lieutenant of the vessel. So now we started to research who was that lieutenant. And in Westfield, Massachusetts, we found this memorial stone, which is utterly remarkable to me, right? This monument is erected to the memory of Lieutenant Thomas Rogers by Miss Molly, his sorrowful widow. He was killed by the splitting of a cannon on Lake Champlain. Right? Woo, gives me the willies even now. This, we have a moment in time captured here that affected not only obviously Jehaziel Sherman and Thomas Rogers, but even his family, and that's true of every person that participated in this battle, all the casualties. And it's something that often I think overlooked or glossed over. This was brutal war, people were dying, and it was affecting people even as far away as Massachusetts. So now let's move into the escape. Right, that's the archaeology that we do hope to go back to Valcour Bay and do some more work there in the future. We'll see how that pans out. But evidence of the retreat south. In 1997, during a sonar survey of Lake Champlain, we found this interesting target in the upper left-hand corner. And divers descended into very deep water, nearly 200 feet of water, and found the completely intact Spitfire still resting on the lake bottom. Again, the mast is in place, even the topmast and the trestle trees are all there. The main gun is in place. The waist guns, the two waist guns are missing. And we can only presume that they were dumped overboard in an attempt to keep the boat afloat as long as possible. And eventually they decided it wasn't worth keeping and they let it sink. Since 1997, there's been a lot of discussion about what to do with the Spitfire. There's been a lot of hemming and hawing and planning and replanning. And there's still a lot of thought going on. It's still a long-term process with this vessel. But in 2022, we had the opportunity to go and carry out a very intensive remote operated vehicle survey of the vessel. And that was carried out with this small ROV, and we brought in some experts. This Japanese gentleman is Kotaro Yamafune, who is a worldwide recognized expert in photogrammetry, which is creating three-dimensional models using photography. And we use this little remote operated vehicle to work in those depths, which are, it's diveable, but you can't stay there very long. So with the ROV, we can send it down there, it can stay there all day. We captured about 30,000 still images of the structure of the boat. And this cool little video, we had two ROVs technically. And here you can see the camera rig trolling over the bow gun. This also gives you a good idea of the murky green water we have in Lake Champlain. But it really did a remarkable job. And at the end of this presentation, I'll hop out of PowerPoint here and I can actually show you the 3D model that was created from this imagery. Really amazing project to be involved with, and it produced some really impressive data. So here's some stills from that 3D model, but we can look at the whole thing later. It is really interesting to compare this with the Philadelphia. There are some subtle differences in its construction, but mostly the same. Since its initial discovery in 1997, we can tell that the topmast and the trestle trees, the cross trees, have been impacted by something, probably a downrigger ball from fishing boat passing through the area, snagged on the trestle trees, and now this topmast is dislodged and it's hanging down further than it used to. This is one of the things that we were able to really quantify with this documentation. Also gives us a really good idea of how much sediment is inside the boat, as we start to think about if we're going to excavate or continue to document this site. It's really great for planning, and it's pretty cool, which is important, I think. All right, so that brings us to the third part of our story here, and that's the story of Arnold's Bay. Arnold's Bay is this beautiful little, tiny little bay, just about 3 miles south of where the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum is in. This is in Panton, Vermont. What had been the Ferris's farm fields have remained virtually untouched. They're now the entire area surrounding Arnold's Bay, except for the very northern tip, is owned by one family who was very gracious in allowing us to come and do research there. The big eyesore on the shoreline here is the Virgin's Panton Water District. This is where there's big water intake from the lake that supplies water to a couple of towns. So that's the only really ugly construction in Arnold's Bay. Other than that, it's fairly untouched. We are here at the top of the bluff, probably where the American defensive line was established. This is the shoreline. The wreck of the Congress is actually over here to the right a little bit. Let's right, just to remind you, this is where the American fleet was run up on shore and burned while the Americans escaped overland. In the 19th century, once again, these boats weren't forgotten. They sunk in shallow water. In the weeks after the burning, the British actually came back in to Ferris's Bay, which one of them calls Destruction Bay, because there's these burning hulks. Apparently they found at least 20 corpses still floating in the lake, and they recovered those bodies and buried them on shore. And then they spent days fishing around in those wrecks and finding cannon and recovering them and any other equipment they could recover from the bottom and incorporate into their fleet. We have some historical documentation that 3 of the gunboats, right, there were 4 gunboats and 1 row galleon here. 3 of the gunboats had been pulled out by the end of the 19th century. One of them possibly by the Ferrises, who may have refloated it and actually used it as a barge. Very, very vague. But we do know that in 1892, the family in Arnold's Bay, which Ferris's Bay became known as Arnold's Bay for obvious reasons, they ran a ferry from Arnold's Bay over to Westport, New York. And this is actually in this picture on the left, that's their ferry boat in the background. They certainly passed right over the Congress remains on a regular basis. And so they decided to, let's pull it ashore. So they muckled onto the back of the boat and pulled about 28 feet of the stern of the Congress off and brought it ashore, where it was displayed as a historical curiosity for a while. Eventually it ended up being moved down to a hotel near the Champlain Bridge, where it eventually rotted away. And there's 2 of the floors remaining. 2 of these V-shaped timbers survived and are at the museum, but the rest of it is unfortunately gone. We do have a number of great pictures of it, which is better than nothing, I guess. But, in 1934, a gentleman he was exploring the bottom of Arnold's Bay in his homemade diving helmet, where his wife had to pump air down to this bucket that he had, anyway, groped around on the bottom of the lake, and he found this 4-pound cannon, which he brought up and displayed at a local resort called Basin Harbor. And he survived to tell it. Right? Better have faith in your significant other to continue to pump air to you. This cannon is also now on display at the Maritime Museum.
Does it have markings?
Nothing distinguishable. It's an odd little gun. The barrel from the trunnions forward has these weird knobs on it. I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. It's a strange little piece. And it was found at the mouth of the bay. So how the hell did we get there? Did it get pushed off one of these boats as they came into the bay? Did the British try to pick it and they dropped it? I don't know. It's an interesting oddity, this cannon. And then we have the recovery of the 4th gunboat by our good friend Lorenzo Haglund, who just can't get enough of pulling shipwrecks out of the water. So He came to Arnold's Bay in 1952, located the last remaining gunboat, and pulled it out. Here you can see his lifting rig with the barrels. Right, they would fill the barrels with water, attach them to the wreck underwater, and then they inject air into those barrels and use it to lift the thing out. It was brought over to the New York side of the lake, to the mouth of the Osable River, where Hagelin had hoped to start a maritime museum. He put it on the shore there on display. Right next to the remains of the very first steamboat to operate on Lake Champlain, Vermont, that he had also recovered from the lake. Unfortunately, this maritime museum never materialized. These two boats rotted away. They got bulldozed, and now there's a KOA campground where these two boats are located. Again, we have a couple of good photographs, but that's about it. Luckily, we do have a number of photographs of the recovery effort, which we've been able to triangulate, do some photographic forensic analysis to get a decent idea of where this boat was recovered from, because that is unclear, is where these other boats were burned, because all the pieces got yanked out.
Any question for you, Ryan?
Sure.
What's the ship in Whitehall?
What's the ship in Whitehall?
Yeah, there's a ship that's been dragged.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm sorry. That is the Ticonderoga, which is a boat that was actually built in Vergennes, Vermont, which is where I live. And it was laid down as a steamboat. It was supposed to be the second steamboat after the Vermont one. And the U.S. Navy stepped in, took over the shipyard at the beginning of the War of 1812. They took this hull and they converted it into a brig, and that became the Ticonderoga. It fought at the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay, which was successful. The Americans captured the entire British fleet. And then all of those, both the American and the British fleets, were taken down to Whitehall, laid up on the shoreline there, where they eventually rotted and sank. And 1950s, 54, I think, they decided we should recover one of these boats and put it on display. So they, again, muckled onto the Ticonderoga, yanked it out of the river. It was proved to be too big, so they ended up cutting it into 4 or 5 pieces. And then they got it up to the shoreline in Whitehall and they kind of mushed it back together. It's still well worth seeing. Have you been? Yeah, it's pretty impressive. Unfortunately, it's just under this,
behind chicken wire.
crappy shed behind chicken wire, snow and everything. Just
Kind of strange.
it's sad. It's really sad, and it's one of those things that the Navy doesn't want to get involved with. The town of Whitehall doesn't have the resources to deal with. It's on the shores of the canal, so we try to get Canal Corps interested in doing something about it. Nobody wants to. Yeah, even if it was just in a better enclosure, it would be better. It's sad. I was actually checking it out a couple of years ago with some field school students, and there's still mud packed into parts of it, which I'm sure has artifacts in it and stuff too. It's really quite remarkable. Now, in the 1960s, a local avocational archaeology group came to Arnold's Bay. They found what was left of the Congress, which they found a mound of ballast stones, which they took out of the hull and set off to the side. They excavated all the dirt out of it, and they recovered, it's about 500 artifacts. It's really incredible stuff. And luckily, this is, once again, all been donated to the Maritime Museum. Technically belongs to the U.S. Navy now, but we curate it on their behalf. But, your typical ship building equipment or ship's equipment, we got a nice caulking iron and adze, which is spectacular. This is part of a trigger guard from a musket. That is part of a sword hand guard. In between here, these are 2 bayonet scabbard belt hooks, right? Like a pocket knife with the belt hook that you can put in your pocket, but it was for a bayonet to fit onto a leather strap. We'll see some more of those. Even some great glassware, including way on the left, bottom left. That tiny little thing is actually the bottom of the tiniest little medicine vial that I've ever seen. It's this tiny little green glass medicine vial. Really cool stuff. We know it's from the Congress. We don't know where in the Congress it's from, but it's nice to have that collection and that assortment of artifacts. Oh, and those are pieces of exploded shell. Probably an 8-inch shell, which is that's a big howitzer shell. Good evidence that some of these exploding shells were hitting their target, because undoubtedly that is something that got blown down into the Congress and was found in its remains. Okay, bringing us up to slightly more current time. Oh, nope, sorry, I forgot. The 1980s, there was a terrestrial excavation of the Ferris homestead. People taking a look at Arnold's Bay recognized the cellar hole from where the Ferris's cabin was, which was right on the edge of that bluff, and it was actually starting to erode into the lake. So kind of a rescue archaeology project was done to document what was left, and did a bunch of work around the homestead. They found a number of pieces of shot during those excavations, which corroborates some historic information we have that at least 2 cannonballs struck the Ferris's house. We found quite a bit of grape shot in this area, or they did, and this was followed by some in-water survey in the 1980s, where they relocated what they thought were the remains of the Congress. But at that time, the visibility in here was really horrible, and they didn't do much more beyond that. In 2001, Maritime Museum staff, with some support from the Department of Defense Legacy Program, did another survey in Arnold's Bay and relocated the forward, 28 feet, probably 40 feet of the Congress, located here. That's that hideous water plant. This is where the Ferris's homestead is. That's where the Congress remains are. And it was identified by that. You can tell that's a boat, right? This is definitely a plank sticking out of the mud here. It's covered in zebra mussels. There's a couple of other timbers around it. If you continue to look around in this area, there's a couple of just, little frame tips sticking out of the mud. And that's what we found when we went back in 2021 and started looking around in Arnold's Bay in our current research project. With some funding from the American Battlefield Protection Program, which is a National Park Service granting agency, we had some money to explore and better define the battlefield at Arnold's Bay. So we found the Ferris's homestead, or what's left of it, which is not much. We know where the Congress remains are, and we determined that we wanted to, try to locate where the 4 gunboats were burned and recovered from, based on their artifact collections. And we wanted to know if there was any evidence of activity on the shoreline and in the farmer's field at the top of the bluff. So we took a multi-pronged approach, which included both terrestrial metal detecting survey and in-water metal detecting survey. As we looked around in the bay, we did find a number of ballast piles. This one is at the stern of the offshore end of that Congress remains. We found one that was almost certainly put there by the Lake Champlain Archaeological Association, because it's just outside of those little frame tips I was talking about. So that's where they took all the rocks and they just put them outside as they were digging down in there. And we did relocate that plank that was sticking out of the mud, cleared off around it a little bit more, and there's definitely some interior hull planking as well as a couple of frame timbers exposed there. So we were pretty confident we were back on the Congress remains. So we wanted to explore, as you can see here, a lot of territory. We didn't quite succeed in all this, but we were certainly interested in looking for the sinking locations. We were interested in exploring the transitional zone of the shoreline and the farm fields beyond. And we started with the terrestrial work. For this, we partnered with an organization called the Advanced Metal Detecting for Archaeologists Group, which actually trains people how to metal detect archaeologically, which is, right, there's always been this weird tension between archaeologists and metal detectorists. And this is kind of bringing the skills of both of those groups together and doing it in an organized fashion, much in the way that we did at Valcourt Bay with divers, right? Bringing people in and showing them the archaeological process and why that's important. We did metal detecting surveys of the shoreline here in yellow and in these selected areas of the farm field. What we realized during this work is that the bluff, this polygon here is actually on that steep bluff. It's not nearly as steep as it used to be. Once they determined that the Ferris Homestead was eroding out of the shoreline, in the 1980s, they came and scraped that bank back to slow down the erosion. Unfortunately, they probably took all kinds of cool artifacts away with them, but we didn't find anything in there. But we did find some great stuff in the other locations, including iron shot, lead shot. Here's another one of these bayonet scabbard hangers, belt hangers, a number of buttons. This is part of a small buckle. And up there in the upper left is a flint wrapper. So this is where a musket flint would be held with a little lead pad that would allow the jaws of the lock of the musket to hold on to the flint better. It was just like a little lead pad that wrapped around the gun flint in a musket. Lots of musket balls, which is going to be a common theme here. All the buttons that we found are unmarked. Unfortunately, they're just plain blank-faced buttons. Lots of interesting stuff, though, both from the shoreline and in the farm fields. Now, for the in-water work, we should clarify that the Congress Hall remains, they still belong to the U.S. Navy. The area around the Congress is state land. That's the bottom lands of the lake that belongs to the state of Vermont. So this goes for all of the projects that we've been discussing. They're all done through the permitting process with the, at Valcourt Bay, we work with the New York State Historic Preservation Office and the U.S. Navy. The Spitfire is managed by those same two organizations as well. And Arnold's Bay is the Vermont Historic Preservation Office and Navy History and Heritage Command, who still have the authority over the Congress remains. So we have a permit from the state of Vermont to do the metal detecting, and we applied for a permit to excavate the remains of the Congress from the Navy. Complicated. Navy vessels remain the owner in ownership of the Navy in perpetuity, no matter where they're sunk, etc. So to examine the bottom around the Congress remains, at this point we didn't have the permit to go look at the Congress. We created these 6 transects underwater, which is really just a 200-foot long tape measure stretched out in a straight line, and then we metal detected to either side of it using pulse induction metal detectors, underwater metal detectors, which you can see one of our divers using here. And my God, we found a lot of artifacts.
Wow.
Each of those pins is an artifact. And those are all color-coded by material type. Like all the light green ones, you can see that giant cluster up near the boat dock. Those are all musket balls. There's iron shot. There's the pink ones, hot pink ones are all nails and fasteners. It's about 700 artifacts total. So it was way more than we expected. And the concentration was so heavy that we didn't cover as much ground as we had hoped, right? This is a relatively small part of the bay. There's some more territory we need to look at. But we found a tremendous amount of material, including more cannonballs, as you might expect, a couple of 6-pound cannonballs. Some of the more interesting things we found include this beautiful little brass inkwell, which would have had a pen holder that was actually screwed to the top that would have held a quill that they would write with, and a little pen knife for shaving your quill. Remarkably, this is glass lined. There's a glass bottle inside the brass that this is fastened around. It's got to be Benedict Arnold's, right? I mean, so the Congress was Benedict Arnold's flagship too, which I probably forgot to mention. But so everything we found, of course, had to be from
Was
them.
everything you found blown up?
Yes. In this case, some of it may actually return to the lake bottom, but it was all brought up for analysis and the conservation of selected items. We found a couple of great spoons and spoon parts. This doesn't look like much, but it is I think it's a lead spoon. Most spoons we find are either silver or pewter. This one appears to be just straight lead, and would be referred to as a rat tail spoon. You can see it has some of our friendly neighborhood zebra mussels attached to it. Pretty mangled. This one, though, is quite exciting. This is just a handle from a spoon, but on the back side, it's got some guy's initials carved into it, which, again, kind of gives you that really cool personal connection. It's got the initials AP etched into the back of it. And while we don't know every person that participated in the Battle of Valcour Island and the retreat south, we know of about 500 people that participated in that battle. And only 2 of them would have the initials AP. Amos Potter and Archibald. That's the second one. Archibald is not really a contender. He was captured on the Rogue Galley, Washington, so he never made it to Arnold's Bay. Amos Potter, we don't really know much more about. Can't say for sure that that's his, but it's an interesting and compelling possibility. We found a number of other armaments. This is part of a bayonet that's up here in the middle. Doesn't have its socket. It's missing the part that slides over the muzzle of the musket, but the blade and the gooseneck are there. And this one, while it's a terrible picture, and it really doesn't look like much, is fascinating because this is a bayonet, but it's just mounted on a stick or a pole. This was not mounted to a musket. This was, some poor schlub was handled this pointy stick. Yeah. We're off to face the Royal Navy. Here's your pointy stick. This appears to have been dropped overboard, and probably the bayonet part went down into the mud. The handle stuck up into the water column for God knows how long, and it's eroded down to about a pencil width. It's a tiny little stick, but then eventually it must have tipped over and then been covered and preserved. But another great example of just how kind of ad hoc the American military was at this time, right? You were fighting with whatever you had. The other great indicator of this ad hoc nature is the musket balls that we found. You can see we've got hundreds of musket balls. They're all of a relatively small size, which suggests that these guys on the Continental forces were probably using their individual firearms that they brought from home, their fowling pieces. If they would have been using British muskets, they would have been a much larger musket ball, which, British soldiers were all issued the same musket. These guys were not. We do find a scattering of 75 caliber musket balls, which would be the British size, the brown best size. We find a few French sized musket balls, which is about 72 caliber. At a later battle site, from the Revolution, once the French had started supplying muskets to the Continental forces, you wouldn't see these small musket balls. Everybody would have the same musket. They would use the same musket balls. So it's really interesting that we're finding lots of these tiny little musket balls. So from this artifact collection, we've been able to draw a few conclusions. We believe that probably just south of the yellow box that indicates where the Congress is, about 100 feet south of there's a concentration of melted lead, and there's some charred wood that we found in the bottom there. And that spot corroborates the photographic evidence of the 1952 gunboat that Haglund recovered. So we not conclusively, but we've narrowed down that as a possibility for the location of one of the gunboats. We don't have any evidence for the other 3 yet, unfortunately. The huge concentration of musket balls on the upper part, on the inshore side, is probably from when the stern of the Congress was pulled off in 1892 and dragged ashore. Right there, where that concentration is located, there's actually about a 2-foot bed bedrock ridge in the bottom. So you can imagine if they broke the back of this boat off and they're dragging it ashore, and it's got to come up this lip. As it comes off, everything just kind of slumps off of it and collects in that spot. That's our working theory, because then it was dragged right ashore there, and that's where it was displayed. Just we've got lots of analysis of this collection. Other interesting things we found include a hand grenade, at least one hand grenade. So it's a very small version of one of those shells that we were talking about before. Still has the wooden fuse stuck in it. There is part of a folding, the hinge from a folding ruler, which might have been used on navigation charts, maybe right next to the inkwell. That's what I'm guessing, in Benny's office. Lots of really interesting stuff. There's a lot more buttons, buckle parts, part of a shoe buckle, which I wish I had a picture of here, but that's another one of those pieces where you're like, this is interesting. Some poor schlub is fought all day at Valcour on the 11th, rowed and sailed all night, all day on the 12th, all day on the 13th, probably didn't eat, probably didn't sleep, watch their friends die, starving to pull into Arnold's Bay, they jump off the boat to escape, and goddamn shoe falls off. Then they got 12 miles to hike down to Crown Point. So anyway, it's just one of those things that, more personal connections there. That's one of the beauties of archaeology in my mind. Finally, at the end of September, we received our permit from the U.S. Navy to go look at the Congress remains. Now, this is very late in the season. I kind of decided we didn't have time to do anything. I talked with my crew, and they were like, come on, let's just go out there and do a little bit. So we dug one trench across the remains of the Congress, using two induction dredges that we had in our inflatable there. That was kind of our dredge barge. Crew of 5 people. We had 5 days of field work. Right, we had these little frame tips sticking up, and what we expected was that this was the bottom of the boat, and you were getting frame tips on either side. So we expected that if we started digging at this side and dug across the wreckage, we'd eventually encounter the center line of the boat, which is where the keel and the keelson would be, right? And then you'd go over that and you'd come up the other side. That's not what we found. What we found was one side of the boat. These frame tips are actually two, right? This frame tip was sticking out, and those frame tips were sticking out. But this, what's flagged as number 1 over there, that's the keel. So, and it's broken apart. So the whole starboard side of the boat broke at the keel and it's flopped over. So we have about 11 feet from the keel out to the ends of these floors and frames. There's 4 ceiling planks still on the interior of those timbers. There's about 14 hull planks out there, and the keel is still there, which for me, that's very exciting. I didn't expect to see the keel at all because it's usually at the bottom and you never get to see it. So how the hell did this happen? Is this evidence of the boat as it burned? There are reports that a number of barrels of gunpowder on board exploded and blew it apart. Is this evidence of it ripping apart from explosions? Is this evidence of it being yanked apart by relic hunters and the family that pulled the stern off? That's a really interesting question, and those are things we're not going to be able to answer until we do some more digging. Also, is the port side there, right? Is the port side just flopped off over here and we just didn't dig there to look? Because that's where all the ballast stones are, right? When in 1960, when they came in and excavated this part, the avocational archaeologists, they took all the stones out of this part and they put them off to the side. Now they're sitting right on top of where the port side of this boat might be. So we're gonna have to.
How long is your permit?
Yeah, it's good for a year, so I have till next September. I'm not applying for it again if I can help it, because it was
How much ice do you have?
a painful process.
How much ice do you have in Champlain?
Obviously it depends on the year. Arnold's Bay being a shallow bay, it's gonna get probably 2 feet of ice in it before it's
You've seen like Ontario, 150-foot long boats pushed up and flat with ice. So flattening them out is pretty typical. I'm sure.
That's certainly possible. Obviously, it's there's both man-made factors and environmental factors. There's the deposition of the ship with the burning and the explosion. Hopefully, if we have the opportunity to uncover more of it, we'll be able to uncover more clues about it. When the excavations were happening in the 1960s here, those guys actually encountered an old timer that lived on the shore of Arnold's Bay, who made the odd buck by going out and tearing a piece off of this boat and carving something out of it. There's canes and gavels and chairs that are made out of timbers of the Congress.
Sure.
Um, yeah, right. It's true of all these recovered wrecks from the past. But I was enormously excited. If this was just the bottom of the boat, this is way more information, right? If you had just the bottom of the boat, then the two sides, in theory, are the same, right? The bottom of the boat is symmetrical. What we have here is a much larger piece of one side, which is actually a lot more information than you would get from small parts of two sides. So I'm very excited to go back and do some more work there. This is also a three-dimensional model. I'm not going to look at this one right now, but this photogrammetry technique allows you to make a scaled model. So by including these sticks of a known length in the model, we can say that is exactly 3 feet long. And then it constrains the rest of the model to those dimensions. So now we can go in and take measurements from this model without having to dive again, and it's all to scale. It's not precise, but it's close enough. If you forgot to take a measurement when you're down there, you can at least guesstimate it from here. Some really nice planks too. This plank, the first ceiling plank here, is at least 18 inches wide. It's a big hunk of wood. So the other really exciting thing about that photogrammetry process is by creating that three-dimensional model, it has also recorded the curvature of that frame section very well. And I'm able to take that curve and compare it with the lines drawing of the Rogue Galley Washington. Right? This is the one that was captured by the British as it retreated. The British have this, thankfully, this anal retentive habit of taking the lines of every ship that they captured and brought into their service. So luckily they did that with the Rogue Galley Washington as well. Now, we don't know that the Congress is identical to the Washington, but all indications suggest that they're probably pretty closely related. So if I have that cross-sectional shape, I can apply it to this body plan, which is looking at the boat in cross-section. And each of these curved lines here are straight vertical lines here on this view of the drawing. So, and when I plot in the curve of that documented piece, it fits right in here between stations 1 and 2, which are way up here in the bow. So our piece of structure is probably from way up here in the bow of the Congress, which makes sense. The boat was run ashore. This is the shore side of the structure. The back end was broken off. So that fits pretty well with our assumptions, our previous assumptions about this boat. Really handy to have this piece of documentation as well. And I'm really excited to do some more work there in the future. So yeah, what's happening next with this project? We've got lots of artifact conservation to do still. We hope to do some more scouting, lay out some more transects further out in the bay to see if we can maybe find anything that tells us where the other gunboats might have been located. Lots of documentary research going on, and we've secured funding to go back and do at least 3 weeks of excavation at the Congress remains while our permit's still in place. And I don't know if that's going to be enough time, but hopefully it will be to at least get a much better idea of what's going on with the structure there. I should also mention that as we did that excavation, we did find a number of artifacts inside the Congress remains. While it seems that the Lake Champlain Archaeological Association recovered most of the big cool stuff from the inside of the Congress, we did still find lots of musket shot buttons, quite a few pork bones and bone fragments from Benny's barbecue dinner, I'm sure. So there's still lots of little pieces of glass. So all that stuff that accumulates in the bilge of a ship, even as short-lived as the Congress was. So of course, need to thank our many different project sponsors, including the American Battlefield Protection Program, the SHPO's Office of New York and Vermont. We worked with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer from the Stockbridge Band of the Muncie, who there were some Native allies both on the American side of this battle and on the British side of this battle, and some of them may have been present on the Congress. And the project could not have happened without, we have particularly two dedicated volunteers who donated more than 1,000 hours of work with us this summer. One of which I showed there holding the cannonball that he recovered. That's Craig Allen. And the other one is Ed Skolin, the gentleman that started the Valcour project back in 1999. He's still into it. He's still excited. And he's now that he's retired from the police force, he spends all his time with us diving and working in Arnold's Bay. So any questions that I can answer for you?
We did have one online, which you addressed a little bit already, but Constant asked, what role, if any, did Native Americans play in this conflict?
Yeah, this, it's still a kind of a blank hole that we're trying to fill in. And that's one of the reasons that we reached out to the federally recognized tribal communities in the area to see if they wanted to participate in the project and if they had any resources that might help to inform the project. We did have some collaboration with them, and that's been great. Hasn't revealed a bunch of detailed information, but we know that some of the Stockbridge militia were on the rogue galleys in particular. They seem to have had a small contingent of Stockbridge militiamen on board. And the British apparently had quite a sizable native contingent with them. At the Battle of Valcour Island, there's reports of British native allies that were landed on Valcour Island and ones that were on the New York shoreline shooting at the ends of the American battle line from the shore. Every once in a while, the Americans would turn and blast a bunch of grape shot into the woods. They would scatter off, and then they'd come back and start sniping again. So definitely some evidence that they participated, but we'd love to have more, of course. Anything else? Yes.
What are you using for your software for the 3D models? Pages software?
Yes, Agisoft. It's called Metashape. Is the latest iteration. And let me.
And you're posting on Sketchfab?
Yes, exactly. This is the 3D model of the Spitfire, which, in this format, we can spin around, we can zoom in. It's really interesting to look straight down on the boat from the top of the mast. There's lots of interesting stuff in here. There's a huge amount, strangely, despite the fact that this boat is in deep, deep water, there's huge amounts of aquatic weed have collected inside the boat. And that's what all these, I can use this little hand, that's what all this is.
Is there any way to X-ray or do whatever technology to look down toward the keel into the bilge of the boat and see what it looks like?
There are things called sub-bottom profilers that would look through sediment. They're really for looking deep into sediment, though. What we have to understand what's going on under the sediment is the Philadelphia, and we have the sister ship to this boat. So we know what the structure under there looks like. We, of course, don't have any idea what artifacts and stuff is hidden under that blanket of silt. There are, back up a little bit. You can see here, this little box on the side appears to be a little ammunition shelf. It's got a number of pieces of lead and iron shot on it. Oh my God. We put some signage on the wreck to let people know that they shouldn't mess with it.
How dangerous do you feel the ROV is for being used on that?
That's a great question. And it's something that we had to negotiate with the Navy. because what the permit that we got is called a special use permit, which is a no impact,
Right.
no excavation, no artifact recovery permit.
Not touch.
Yeah, right. And so if the big concern was getting the tether of the ROV snagged in a trestle tree, or possibly this piece of railing that's popped up here gave me nightmares. You know, you fly through that and drag your tail with you, and then you're wrapped around.
Could you state a budgetary term for generating
How much did it cost?
it's better a 3D model like that.
Well, so I had Coda, my buddy Kotari on When I do this. He took the 30,000 photographs, put them into Agisoft, let it cook for 6 days,
Oh my.
just to align the photos. And it's a multi-step process. You align the photos, then it builds a mesh, and then you put a surface on it. So it took him a couple of weeks just of processing time. It was about a $5,000 operation just for the modeling. Luckily, the boat time was donated. The ROV we had, and we just attached lights and GoPros to. This was definitely,
We use GoPros.
we used GoPros using time-lapse photography. As you probably saw, we had six dive lights attached to it. Now and that's a $3,500 ROV. You know, we're not talking about the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is a Chasing M2, yes. And the ROV that filmed the chasing was a Fish, which only has 6 thrusters. The M2 has 8, and it can handle all the extra cameras and lights, and you can imagine.
The one they're using, the Finger Lakes, is scanning sonar, and they can tell it to go down, stay 10 foot off the wreck. And
Yeah, that's really cool. We don't have to. That would be really cool. What we actually started to do was to lower down a huge cluster of lights on a rope that illuminate the whole site. Well, not the whole site, but a portion of the site at a time, and then you can drive the ROV around in there much more easily. Yes, other questions?
I had the opportunity to dive on it. It's probably related. That's why you didn't connect this. I had the opportunity to dive on a vessel in Lake George.
Mhm.
And the state was aware of it. I mean, it already had been gridded out. It was a vessel that they claimed they were building during the fall. And in order for them not to fall into British hands, this was before they actually got up to Ticonderoga. They set them out on the ice, but one of them got away and dropped, instead of into 30 feet where they could recover it, dropped into 105 feet of water.
Yes.
That vessel was in immaculate shape.
Yes.
Still had the leather in the overlock area. There was very little silt in it. What would be the difference between where that vessel sat in 105 feet?
The difference is Lake George.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, Lake George, the water clarity, as I'm sure you know, is in Lake George is beautiful.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
immaculate. That's because the watershed of Lake George is tiny, right? There's a number of little creeks that flow into it, but the basin itself is, and there's no major tributaries. None of those tributaries flow through farm fields, right? It's steep mountains into this beautiful little lake.
No, this vessel that I'm talking about, they were going to use them to take the troops up to.
Yeah,
Ticonderoga.
you're talking about the land tortoise,
Yes.
which is was another one of these floating gun batteries, like the large one that the British had at Valcour called the Thunderer. And it's really it looks like the bastion of an 18th century fort. It's pointed on the end and it's blocked off. The sides actually slope in a little bit, and it has gun ports out the side. And yeah, it was not uncommon for them to sink boats in the fall and then recover them in the winter. They couldn't be damaged, dried out. Raiding parties couldn't burn them underwater, which was a common occurrence. The boat you're talking about is a French and Indian War vessel. So it's even older than
Older
this.
than that. Okay.
And it is, it does appear that they kept putting rocks in it to sink it. And instead of it just going straight down, it's flat bottomed. You throw a flat rock in the water. What does it do? It goes like this, right? And this one went into 110 feet of water and
But did they use vessels similar to that to go up the lake, is what I'm asking, from Lake George?
Well, so Ticonderoga, the fort at Ticonderoga sits where Lake George empties into Lake Champlain, right? It's at the mouth of the creek that is the outflow of Lake George. So they definitely were transporting the Abercrombie's attack on Fort Ticonderoga in 1759. They had a number of sailing ships. They had more than 900 bateaux that they used to transport troops. I don't know that the land tortoise would have been used as a troop transport as much as a gun battery. Yeah, it's a floating gun battery.
So we had another one online. Kipperly asked which gondola was dragged to Osable. I'm not pronouncing that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we don't really know, unfortunately. The 4 gunboats that were pulled into Arnold's Bay, let's see if I can remember this. One of them was Providence, New Haven, Connecticut, and Boston. Those are the 4 options. But that's all I can say. One of those. The other ones are all accounted for now that we know where the Spitfire is. Any other questions? I realize I've dominated. What's that?
Any human remains discovered?
Not as of yet, thank God. Things get really complicated when that happens, and certainly not an impossibility in the Spitfire. Though being an open deck vessel, there is no below decks on this boat. It's also quite likely that any human remains would have floated out of such a boat. In the Congress, we found a lot of bone, but none of it seems to be human at this point. Lots of, like I said, lots of pork bone, some deer bones, pumpkin seeds, stuff like that. But thankfully, no human remains as of yet. Now, what we've discussed tonight is really just the archaeology of the Battle of Lake Champlain that took place in 1776. Lake Champlain continued to be an important, avenue of transportation through the end of the war. There were a number of other raids and campaigns that happened around Lake Champlain, but this is the main naval component. And while the Battle of Valcour Island was, and the subsequent flight to Arnold's Bay, was certainly a tactical defeat for the American Navy, it delayed the invasion by an entire year. Right after the British saw this fleet burn, they did continue up the lake. They looked at Fort Ticonderoga, which at that point had a huge amount of men and material there. There was the construction of Mount Independence on the Vermont side, opposite of Fort Ticonderoga. And the British said, yeah, we'll come back next year and take care of this. So, and that led to the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, at which time the Americans were able to bring together a large enough force to actually defeat that British invasion. And it was the decisive American victory at Saratoga that brought the French into the war on the American side. So while it was a tactical defeat, it was certainly a strategic delaying action that proved to be very valuable.
Much like Hubbardton.
Yeah, and Hubbardton and Bennington are battles that happened during that 1777 invasion. When the British, they swept down the lake, they took Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence without a shot being fired hardly, and right down to the other end of the lake. The few boats that did escape Arnold's Bay and Valcour Bay carried American troops to the southern end of the lake in 1777 as they escaped, and they were burned and destroyed there. Unfortunately, their remains were probably all dredged up in the early 20th century when the barge canal was put in through Whitehall. But a super important event that I don't think gets as much play outside of the region as it should. So I think I've kept you plenty long. Molly can help anybody reach out to me if you have other questions, if you have anything that comes up later. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming out and listening to me talk.
Thank you.